I hired security to ban my parents from the wedding they paid for because they ruin my aesthetic and will embarrass me. So my dad canceled everything to teach me a lesson. I completely lost it. I'm getting married in a few weeks. My partner and I wanted a very specific kind of wedding. Not huge, not chaotic, not family-centered in the traditional sense. Clean, controlled, curated. We didn't want speeches going off the rails, relatives crying loudly, drunk uncles embarrassing us, or anything that would turn the day into something we didn't recognize. This wasn't about being cruel. It was about protecting something that was supposed to be ours. My parents paid for the wedding. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. They offered early on, and yes, it made things easier. Venue, catering, decor, rentals all covered. Most of the vendors were booked under my dad's name because that's just how he insisted on doing it. I knew there were strings. I just didn't think those strings meant they got full access to everything and everyone. My parents are a lot. They're loud. They're opinionated. They don't blend into the background. My mom cries at inappropriate moments and makes things about herself without meaning to. My dad drinks and thinks he's funny when he's had a few. They aren't bad people, but they are not subtle, and they do not fit the kind of event we were trying to have. This became an ongoing issue during planning. My partner would point things out constantly, how my dad would ruin photos by wandering into shots, how my mom would corner guests and overshare, how neither of them listened when asked to tone things down. Every conversation about the wedding turned into a negotiation about managing them. Eventually, it stopped feeling manageable. I made a decision that I knew would upset people, but I genuinely believed it was preventative. I hired private security for the event, not unusual for weddings at our venue. I gave them a short list of people who were not to be allowed entry under any circumstances. My parents were on that list. I didn't announce this. I didn't warn them. I didn't want to blow up beforehand, and I didn't want to be guilted into backing down. My thinking was simple. If they never got inside, they couldn't cause a scene. If they were quietly turned away, it would be awkward but contained. One bad moment instead of an entire day, ruined. The rehearsal dinner is where everything exploded. My parents showed up early. Security stopped them at the entrance. Other guests were already there. People watched. My parents were confused at first, then angry. My mom was crying. My dad was demanding explanations. I was inside and heard about it almost immediately. I didn't rush out. I hesitated. My partner told me not to undermine the decision and to let security do their job. I agreed. I thought stepping in would just escalate things further. Eventually, my parents left. No screaming match, no dramatic scene, just a very public rejection and a lot of people whispering. Later that night, my dad sent me a single text. "If this is how you want to do it, fine." That was it. Since then, everything has gone nuclear. My parents are acting like I humiliated them on purpose. They're telling relatives that I threw them out of my wedding. They're framing it as betrayal instead of what it actually was, setting boundaries. What's frustrating is that no one seems to care why I did it. No one cares that this is my wedding. No one cares that I'm allowed to decide what kind of environment I want on one of the biggest days of my life. All anyone sees is that they paid, and I didn't let them in. I know how it sounds. I know Reddit loves to jump on people who accept money and then push back. But accepting help doesn't mean giving up autonomy. Paying for something shouldn't buy you unlimited access or immunity from consequences. My partner is firmly on my side. They think my parents have been controlling from the start and are only angry now because they lost leverage. I agree. If this was really about love and support, they wouldn't be making it about money and public embarrassment. I'm angry. I feel disrespected. I feel like I'm being punished for not playing along. So I'm asking here because I need to know if I'm missing something big, or if everyone else is just reacting emotionally. Was I wrong for hiring security to keep my parents out of a wedding they paid for? If I genuinely believed they would embarrass me and ruin the day? Update 1. I didn't even make it 24 hours before everything fell apart. I woke up to my phone vibrating non-stop. Missed calls, emails, texts, notifications from numbers I didn't recognize at first. For a few seconds, I thought something had happened to one of my parents, like an emergency or a medical issue, because that was the only explanation that made sense for that volume of contact overnight. That wasn't it. It was the wedding. The first voicemail I listened to was from the venue coordinator. Her tone was professional but stiff, like she was reading from a script. She said the reservation had been canceled effective immediately, and that any further questions should be directed to the account holder. The next email was from catering saying the same thing, then rentals, then florals. One by one, every major piece of the wedding was gone. I called my dad, straight to voicemail. I called my mom. No answer. That's when it hit me that this wasn't a bluff or a tantrum. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't show up to argue. He just pulled the plug. Every single contract had been in his name. I knew that, but I never thought it would matter. In my head, it was a formality, not leverage. Overnight, it became very clear how wrong I was. There were no refunds, deposits were gone, dates were released. Some vendors didn't even ask for confirmation from me because, as far as they were concerned, I was never their client in the first place. I went from angry to panicked in about 10 minutes. My partner didn't react the way I expected. They weren't shocked or scared. They were furious, but not in a loud way. It was the kind of anger that turns sharp and focused. They immediately framed what my parents did as retaliation, financial abuse, punishment for not obeying. They said this wasn't about respect, it was about control. Instead of telling me to calm down or take a breath, they pushed me to respond aggressively. They said I needed to threaten legal action, that my parents couldn't just cancel things that were meant for me, that it didn't matter whose name was on the paperwork if the intention was always that the wedding was mine. They told me to stop thinking emotionally and start thinking strategically. I emailed my parents demanding they reinstate everything or transfer the funds so I could rebook. I laid out how much damage they were causing. I accused them of trying to humiliate me publicly. I made it very clear that I wasn't going to just let this go quietly. They didn't reply. As the day went on, things started to feel off in ways I didn't anticipate. Vendors I reached out to directly were suddenly cold, short responses, delayed replies. Some stopped responding entirely. One coordinator I had been friendly with before gave me a vague explanation about being told to stand down and not discuss details further. That was the first moment I realized my parents weren't reacting emotionally. They were being methodical. They weren't blasting me to the family. They weren't posting online. They weren't screaming at me through intermediaries. They were quietly closing doors. I started hearing from relatives, but not in the way I expected. No one asked me what happened. No one checked in. Instead, I got messages asking if everything was okay with the wedding, saying they'd heard it was on hold, asking if they should cancel travel plans. The phrasing was careful, like they'd been given just enough information to step back without taking sides. That scared me more than outright confrontation. My partner kept pushing me to escalate. They said silence was my parents' way of winning, that if I didn't hit back harder, I'd be admitting fault. They encouraged me to document everything and frame it as my parents stealing from me, sabotaging my future, punishing me for asserting boundaries. I sent another message, this one angrier. I accused them of manipulation. I implied I'd be forced to tell people the truth about how controlling they were if they didn't fix this. I told them they were destroying their relationship with me over ego. Again, no response. By that evening, the reality set in. We no longer had a venue. The date we wanted was already being offered to someone else. Catering availability was gone. Rentals were booked solid for that weekend. Even if we found replacements, the cost would be significantly higher, and none of the original deposits were coming back. I felt like I'd stepped into a version of my life where the rules had suddenly changed, and no one bothered to explain them to me. I kept thinking this was temporary, that my dad would cool off, that my mom would reach out, that someone would crack. No one did. What made it worse was realizing how exposed I was. I had built this entire plan assuming support that I didn't technically control. I had made decisions based on access to resources that could be revoked at any time. I didn't want to admit that to myself, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. And the scariest part is realizing my parents don't need to argue with me to take everything away. They just had to stop paying and let the system do the rest. Update 2. We were sitting at home trying to figure out next steps, going over numbers, timelines, what could realistically be salvaged. My partner was quieter than usual, distracted. At some point, they mentioned needing to call their landlord and hesitated in a way that didn't make sense. When I asked why, they brushed it off at first, then finally admitted the rent situation had changed. That's when everything started to come out. My parents had been covering my partner's rent. Not permanently, not formally, but temporarily, as it had been described. It was framed as helping us get on our feet while planning the wedding. On top of that, they were paying for my partner's phone plan and insurance. None of this had ever been presented to me as leverage. It was just handled quietly, in the background, like a convenience. All of it was gone. No dramatic announcement, no warning. Payments stopped, accounts canceled. My parents didn't call to explain or threaten. They just pulled out completely, like they'd been waiting for the moment to do it cleanly. That was the point where panic turned into something closer to paranoia. My partner did not take this well. They stopped framing my parents as merely controlling and started blaming me directly. Not loudly, not hysterically, but with a sharpness that hadn't been there before. They said I should have managed my parents better, that I should have anticipated retaliation, that letting things get this far showed a lack of foresight on my part. They started pushing for confrontation, not a call, not mediation, showing up, unannounced, forcing a conversation before my parents could keep tightening the screws. They said waiting was letting them win, and that silence was just another tactic. At the same time, I noticed my partner making plans that didn't include me, looking into short-term housing options, rearranging personal finances, talking about backup scenarios without actually looping me in. It felt less like teamwork and more like I was being evaluated. That made me angry enough to finally go to my parents' house. I didn't announce it. I just showed up. They let me in, which almost threw me off more than if they hadn't. There was no shouting. No immediate confrontation. They were calm in a way that felt deliberate, like they'd already had the emotional conversation without me and were done processing it. My dad laid it out plainly. The wedding money was conditional, not in a manipulative way, but in a respect-based way. He said funding something while being treated like a liability crossed a line he wasn't willing to ignore. Hiring security to block them, especially publicly, was the moment things changed. My mom cried, but not the way she usually does. It wasn't about being excluded from the wedding. It was about what kind of person she thought I had become. That hit harder than I expected, and instead of backing down, I lashed out. I brought up everything. Money they'd spent on me growing up, expectations, how much control they'd always had. I accused them of using finances to dictate my life. I told them they cared more about appearances than about me, even though that accusation probably applied to all of us in different ways. It escalated fast. I said things I knew would hurt because I wanted to regain some kind of footing. I brought up sacrifices they'd made as if they were debts I never agreed to. I framed their help as manipulation instead of support. I didn't hold back. They didn't yell back. They asked me to leave. Walking out of that house felt different than the rehearsal dinner. That time, I still believed this was a standoff that would resolve itself. This time, it felt final in a way I couldn't undo by sending another message or making another demand. My parents stopped responding entirely after that. No texts, no emails, no indirect messages through relatives, nothing. At home, the atmosphere shifted. My partner is colder, more impatient, less interested in how I feel, and more focused on what I was going to do next. The wedding is still treated as non-negotiable. Canceling or downsizing is framed as public humiliation we can't afford. I still don't feel guilty about the security decision. I feel angry that my parents had prepared for this outcome better than I had. Update 3. At this point, the problem isn't that the wedding is expensive. It's that the cost never actually went away, it just moved. The deposits my parents had paid were gone, non-refundable. That money didn't disappear from the equation, it just meant vendors still expected to be paid again if we wanted to keep anything close to what we'd planned. Every conversation ended with numbers that didn't line up and timelines that kept tightening. What surprised me was how little flexibility there was on my partner's side. Downgrading wasn't an option. Changing venues wasn't an option. Reducing the guest list wasn't an option. Anything that altered the original look or scale was framed as unacceptable. Not inconvenient, unacceptable. The word humiliating came up a lot. Canceling or scaling back was treated like something worse than debt. So instead of shrinking the wedding, the financial pressure just shifted directly onto me. I started taking out personal loans, then another, then putting things on credit cards I'd always promised myself I'd never use like that. Vendors who had once spoken to me politely now called directly, reminding me of payment schedules and late fees. Some were understanding, others weren't. From their perspective, I was the one who wanted the event to go forward, and they didn't care how I made that happen. My parents stayed completely silent through all of this. No check-ins, no offers, no warnings. It wasn't even hostility anymore, just absence. There was no one to argue with, no one to pressure, no one to guilt. That was somehow worse than if they'd yelled. At home, my partner's expectations hardened into assumptions. They didn't threaten to leave. They didn't cry or accuse me of ruining things. They just expected me to fix it. Any hesitation on my part was met with impatience, like I was stalling on purpose. The message was clear. This was my problem to solve. That's when I started cracking in smaller, quieter ways. I was exhausted all the time, not just physically, but mentally. Every day felt like juggling deadlines I couldn't afford to miss. I stopped explaining myself because it didn't change anything. I stopped apologizing because it just sounded hollow after a while. Somewhere in all of that, I reconnected with someone from before. Not an ex in a dramatic sense. Just someone I'd known years ago who still existed outside this situation. It didn't start as anything deliberate. We talked. That was it at first. No wedding talk, no budgeting, no pressure. They didn't ask me what was wrong or how I was feeling. They didn't need reassurance or promises. They didn't look at me like I was a problem waiting to be solved. Being around them felt quiet in a way my life hadn't been for months. I didn't think of it as cheating at the time. I didn't frame it as betrayal or revenge. It felt more like stepping into a room where nothing was expected of me, somewhere I didn't have to perform competence or control. I justified it easily. Stress, pressure, feeling cornered, carrying everything alone. I told myself it wasn't emotional, that it wasn't serious, that it was temporary. I told myself that if I was the one absorbing all the financial damage, I was allowed something that didn't take anything else from me. I didn't confess. I didn't feel particularly guilty. Mostly I felt numb. At home my behavior shifted. I was colder without meaning to be, less responsive, less engaged. I stopped trying to smooth things over because it never seemed to help. I wasn't warm, but I also wasn't openly hostile. I just withdrew. My partner noticed, but not in the way you might expect. They chalked it up to wedding stress, deadlines, money, family drama. They didn't push too hard because, in their mind, this was the cost of getting everything to the finish line. There was a point where I realized I was no longer thinking in terms of us the way I used to. The wedding wasn't something we were building together anymore. It was a structure I was holding up alone because letting it collapse would destroy me financially and socially. That realization changed how I justified things internally. If I was the one paying for everything now, if I was the one taking on debt that would follow me for years, then loyalty stopped feeling like a shared obligation. It started feeling conditional, transactional, something that only mattered as long as the balance felt even. I wasn't proud of that mindset, but I didn't fight it either. The strange part is that nothing exploded during this time. There were no big fights, no dramatic confrontations, just a steady, quiet deterioration. The wedding planning continued. Payments went out, invitations stayed sent, social media still showed excitement and countdowns. From the outside, it probably looked like things were stabilizing. Internally, it felt like I was cutting corners just to stay upright. I didn't feel ashamed. I didn't feel justified in a righteous way either. I felt entitled to something that made the pressure ease, even temporarily. That's the best way I can describe it. By the end of this phase, I wasn't asking myself how to fix things anymore. I was asking myself how to survive them without losing whatever control I had left. And at the time, this felt like the only way to do that. Final update. The wedding still happened. I know that's the part people expect to end differently. A blow-up, a cancellation, someone finally backing down. None of that happened. Once the money was spent and the debts were real, stopping stopped being an option. My partner never wavered on that point. There was no discussion about postponing, no serious talk about pulling the plug. Every time I circled back to it, the answer was the same. Everything was already in motion, and backing out would destroy us publicly and financially. At that stage, I was too exposed to argue, so we went through with it. Same venue, same guest count, same look. On the surface, it was the wedding we'd planned from the beginning. People complimented it. Photos looked good. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. My parents weren't there. That absence was noticeable, but it was explained away quietly as family issues and left at that. I didn't feel relief when it was over. I felt empty. What I didn't know at the time was that my partner had already decided when to tell me the rest. It didn't come out immediately. Not on the honeymoon. Not in the weeks right after. Things stayed tense but functional. We went through the motions. Public appearances. Thank you messages. Normalcy. I thought the distance between us was just the aftermath of stress and debt. It wasn't. The truth came out later, after I finally confronted them about how disconnected everything felt and why nothing seemed to be improving. That's when they told me they'd been sleeping with my best friend. Not once, not a mistake, ongoing. The timing wasn't accidental. They waited until after the wedding, after the paperwork was done, after finances were fully tangled. Waiting mattered. They were very clear about that part without saying it outright. They didn't deny it. They didn't soften it. There was no apology in the way people usually mean when they say that word. They explained it like a calculation. Since my parents had cut funding, since I was stretched thin, since I had failed to deliver stability when it mattered most, they felt justified finding support somewhere else. Emotional, practical, financial. They framed it as compensation for carrying uncertainty while I scrambled. What made it worse was how calmly it was said. I reacted badly. I threatened divorce immediately. That was the first thing out of my mouth because it was the only lever I could think of pulling. My partner didn't panic. They didn't argue. They explained that I couldn't afford one. They weren't wrong. Most of the wedding debt was in my name. Loans, credit cards, vendor agreements. Our assets were now shared, but the liability leaned heavily toward me. Any clean break would require money I didn't have and time I couldn't afford. They had known that. They had planned around it. Then came the part I didn't expect. They told me they knew about my cheating too. Not recently, not accidentally. They had found out earlier and chose not to say anything. They let it continue. They kept quiet. They used it as justification in their own mind and leverage in practice. Silence wasn't forgiveness. It was storage. Something to pull out when needed. That realization landed harder than the affair itself. At that point, there wasn't a dramatic explosion. No screaming, no throwing things, no ultimatums that mattered. We were already past the point where emotion could change the math. Everything that followed was quiet and procedural. We're still married, not because we worked it out, not because we chose each other again, because separating would make everything worse in concrete, measurable ways. We live in the same house but not the same space. Separate rooms. Shared responsibilities handled like a checklist. We show up where we're expected to show up. From the outside, we probably look fine. There are no big fights anymore, just tension that never fully dissipates. A sense that every interaction is transactional, every compromise temporary. My parents haven't reached out. I haven't either. At this point, I don't know what I'd even say. Too much happened without resolution for a clean conversation to exist. I don't feel forgiven. I don't feel punished in a way that feels proportional or instructive. I feel stuck inside something that was engineered slowly, piece by piece, while I was focused on winning smaller battles. I used to think getting married would stabilize everything, that once the wedding was over, the chaos would stop and things would settle into something manageable. I was wrong.